So the topic we will be discussing today is one of the most fascinating, baffling sugyas in Hilchos Shabbos. It has been 150 years since man understood that he could take advantage of this awesome energy of electricity. And man has devised 1,000 different applications of electricity. The world of halacha has been dealing and grappling with this sugya for more than 120 years. The first two poskim to address the question, is it permissible to close an electrical circuit? So they didn't speak about electrical circuits, but they did speak about using electricity. Rav Yitzchok Shmelkes, Shuvas Beis Yitzchok, Yored Deyes Melamed Aleph in the Hashmotas at the end of the Sefer. HaRav, Chelik Beisim and Reish Mem Zayin. The Marsham, the Rav of Brajan, the Beis Yitzchok, the Rav of Lemberg, were the two greatest poskim of their generation, Gedolei Galicia. So the Beis Yitzchok talks about telegraph, sending a telegraph. The Marsham talks about lighting. But both reach the same conclusion. It is not permissible. Not exactly the same definition. So the Beis Yitzchok says it's an Isser D'Rabbanan of Moilid. Some people confuse Noilad with Moilid, two concepts. Noilad is a din in Muktzah. Moilid we find primarily in two sugyas. One is ein meraskin es hasheleg. You can't crush ice to achieve water. The other is moiled reyach. There's an issue to be moiled reyach in garments and begodim. Rashi Beit Zechov Gemel Amud Aleph. HaMoiled dovar chodosh koroivu la'oisem halacha chadosh. And therefore, moiled is a shvus, an Isser D'Rabbanan. The Maharsham doesn't go into detail what is the Isser of electricity. But the fundamental Yesod and argument of the Maharsham is, regardless of what malacha it may be, it cannot be a malacha d'oraisa because it's not dumya de mishkan. I think a few months ago, I already gave a shir in the Yarchikalia on the very concept of Dumya de Mishkan. And I quoted this Masham together with about 12 different sources. To what degree does a malacha need to be Dumya de Mishkan to be defined as Malaches Machsheres? I won't go over that again. Hatzad HaShoveh Shebehein, the common denominator between the opinions of these two giants, the greatest poskim of their generation, we're dealing with an Isser D'Rabbanan. One generation later, we find two other giants. One could say the major poskim of their era. The Chazon Ish, Orach Chaim Simenun Ot Tet, and the Achiezer Chelik Gimel Simen Samach. Chazon Ish and Achiezer both say we're dealing with a malacha d'oraisa, not merely a malacha d'Rabbanan. And just like I pointed out, the Beis Yitzchok clearly says what the Yisr is. The Marsham is more vague. He doesn't go into detail what is the malacha, but he says it's midrabanan. We find the same Chazon Ish and Achiezer. The Achiezer doesn't go into much detail what is the malacha, but he says it's a malacha d'oraisa. The Chazon Ish specifies, and the Chazon Ish says we're dealing with boina. Boina and the Chazon Ish seems to be a big chiddush. The Achiezer refuses to go into detail, and this is an interesting hashkafa of the Achiezer. To my Talmidim and Koilel, I gave a series of shiurim regarding hashkafas halacha, One might say the philosophy of halacha. I am very sensitive to terminology, the words I choose. The philosophy of halacha doesn't sound right to sensitive ears. Hashkofas ha'halacha. So the Achiezer refuses to go into detail. And it is quite clear the reason of his reluctance is when we go into detail, people will always find room for skepticism, for argumentation. So the Achiezer says, it is the collective opinion of all Gedolei Yisrael. We're dealing with Chashash Malocha D'Oraisa, and that's it. That's it. I think the Achiezer was very wise, and I will explain why. So the Chazon Ish argues, Boina. Why is this Boina? So the Chazon Ish deals with what was relevant in his day and age, going back 70 or 80 years. There is no date when the Chazon Ish wrote his initial opinion. In Minchas Shloimeh, there's a series of letters that the Chazon Ish wrote to Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And Shlomo Zalman has a huge fundamental tshuva and discussion in Minchas Shloimeh Chelek Aleph. So the Chazon Ish was dealing with pressing a switch, putting on your light. So I really don't know in American modern homes how one puts on his light. You know, today we have these smartphones, we have smart homes. But when I grew up, when we all grew up, you just press the switch. So behind the plastic cover, there are two pieces of metal, positive and negative. Contrary to what people will guess, electrons flow from negative to positive, not the other way around. So the flow of electrons is what we define as electricity. From the negative pole to the positive. So the Chazon Ish maintains putting these two pieces of metal together is boina. But by boina, you need to be toikeya. And toikeya means it needs to be a strong chibur. Just touching things is never boina. If you put one brick on top of the other, that's not boina. Boina is only if you use tit, you use mortar, you use material to paste them together. That's boina. Merely putting one object in another is not boina. You need to connect them. You could use screws, you could need nails, you could use mortar, you could use whatever you want to use. So the Chazon Ish has an amazing argument, and he writes, but the flow of electrons, which is power, which is energy, which is electricity, that is nechshav ketorkeya. In a letter to the Shlomo Zalman, he uses different words, and he writes, bringing life into those dead, dormant wires, that is like torkeya. So the Chazon Ish writes various different signoinus and emphasis. Why connecting those two pieces of metal would be considered torkeya. B'yasoidoi shel davar, the opinion of the Chazon Ish is closing an electrical circuit is prohibited. It's a malacha d'oraisa of boin. So these are the two fundamental approaches we find b'gedolei achronim. According to the Bisakar Mesham, we're dealing with malacha d'Rabbanan. Achiezer Chazon Ish d'oraisa. Which malacha? According to the Beis Yitzchak Moiled, it is something new. You brought something new. So crushing ice to achieve water is new. Moired reach is new. Electricity. You brought forth something new and something significant. That is moiled. According to the Chazon Ish, we're dealing with a baina. In recent years, things have become more complicated. We're no longer dealing with a switch in which there are two pieces of metal which you see with your eyes, you bring them together. That, in a way, is fundamentally similar to Baina. Maniach ariach al gabei leveno. Two huge pieces of wood screwed together to build a house, to build a wall. How about lighting? The Chiezer writes that would be Maviyah. So does the Chazon Ish write. But that was when we used incandescent lights. How about LED? It's a total different technology. There is no heat in LED lights. It's a different technology. And how about microelectronics using your computer? It's almost microscopic. And those circuits are sometimes in nanoseconds. Is it reasonable to define microelectronics as Baina? Extremely unreasonable. We're no longer dealing with metal objects that you see with your eyes that are an inch big, each one. We're dealing with microelectronics. Would that be defined as Baina? Not so reasonable. So in recent years, there were various different Rabbanim that came out with huge kulas. So if it's not Baina, what is it? If the Chazon Ish rejects the Beis Yitzchak, so it wouldn't even be in his Rabbanim. And if it's not Baina, some Rabbanim wrote, Uvde de Choyel. To me, when we say that electricity is Uvde de Choyel, it is almost as if we say, go ahead and put on the light. Go ahead and use your washing machine. Uvde de Choyel, be'eni abrius, is almost a heter. And if we say Uvde de Choyel, we open the floor to argument. Why would it be Uvde de Choyel? Why? If 100,000 frum Jews would decide to use electricity, it would no longer be Uvde de Choyel. So I am very hostile to the approach of Uvde de Choyel. If you say Uvde de Choyel, in other words, you said, okay, you could use electricity. And to me, I'm using the sprach of the Orcha Shulchan and Orchaim Kuf Chof Ches in a totally different sugya. I'm just using his lashon. Ki'ilu baskol yatso ben hashamayim. That one should not use electricity on Shabbos. I wrote about electricity on Shabbos in all 3 volumes of Shalas Tshuvas Minchas Osher. Chelik Aleph, Lamed Aleph, Lamed Beis, Lamed Gimel, Chelik Beis, and Lamed Daled. I don't record on Chelik Gimel. So my approach is a new, probably novel approach. And to me, using any form of electricity or electronics, LED, microelectronics, it is all a cheshash malocha dioraisa of maka bepatish. And this is an essay, a siman that I wrote many years ago. And then I saw others, following in my footsteps, some of them quoting what I wrote, others were kinda with shinui. Shinui Rashus, Shinui Maise, Shinui Shem. So there's a fascinating Yerushalmi, Shabbos Mem Daled Amud Aleph. And the Yerushalmi actually is a story. Reb Yochanan ben Shlokish learned Malachas Shabbos 3.5 years. Sometimes the yeshivas complain that in yeshivas we learn too slow. I agree with them. I'm a Talmud of the Kleisen Magarebi. And that was one of his big malchamas. We do learn too slow. But sometimes we also learn too fast. So the Chazon Ish was once asked by a very close Ben Weiss, is it true that you learned 40 daf in a day? And the Chazon Ish responded, many times I learned 30 days, one daf. A Gadol B'Yisrael needs to be able to learn 40 blat in one day. He needs to be able to learn 40 days, one blat. And only the combination of the two is true godless. So let's see the Yerushalmi. It's on our screen. Rabbi Yochanan ben Shlokesh avdin havaya bahadu perket lashminu plug. They learned 3.5 years Malachas Shabbos. Quite slow. But that's the way they learned. They probably learned other sugyas, 40 blat in a day. But let's see what the Yerushalmi says. Afkun minei arbom chosarachas told us al kol chodev v'chodev. They found 39 toldos on every Av. I don't know why, but it's not relevant. Min da ashkechun mismuch samchun, hu de lo ashkechun mismuch avdinu mishomaka bepatesh. And that is a fascinating statement. Fascinating. This is a totally new approach to Lamites Malachas. Because the standard approach would be, whenever we have a shaila, person asks, is this a malacha or not? So we start going through the list. Chodesh, Zoreya, Koitza, Ma'amer, Zoira, Boira, Meraked, Dash. Is it similar to any of the malachas? If not, it's not a malacha. Rabbi Yochanan Shlokesh after 39 days had a totally different approach. People ask shaylas. Min the ashkochen mismuch samchen. If they found that this act or deed is similar to any of the lamet ches malachas, then obviously it's a told of that malacha. And if it isn't similar to any of the lamet ches, then it's makam bepadish. So what we learn from this Yerushalmi, the approach of Rabbi Yochanan Shlokesh was, when a shaila comes before you, is something permissible on Shabbos or not? The first question you ask yourself, is this malaches machsheves? It is a malacha of importance, of significance, of chidush, of creativity. Then it's a malacha. The defining factor is malaches machsheves. Only then do we need to try to figure out it's a malacha. So which malacha is it? If it bears similarity to any of the first lamet ches, then it's a told of that malacha. If it bears no similarity to the lamet ches, but still it is malaches machsheves because of its creativity, significance, importance, then it's makeh bepadish. And I try to imagine Rabbi Yochanan Shlokesh holding the entire Beis Medrash, the entire city in suspense. 3.5 years. They're learning Dina Malachas Shabbos. Finally, they sent out a message, an email. Next week, Sunday, we will receive shaylas and we will paskin every question. Somebody took a carpenter and he built a long, long table. And on that table, there were 38 bowls. At the end of the table, number 39 wasn't a bowl, but a big barrel. So people came to ask questions. The first 38 bowls were Chodesh, Zoreya, Koitza, Ma'amar. With every question, they strolled down the table. And if it didn't fit into any of the 38 bowls, it was dropped into the barrel of makeh bepadish. I am aware that this is a totally new Hagdorah. A new Hagdorah in two different realms. Number one, fundamental approach. Malachas Machsheves comes before the Lamites Malachas, not after the Lamites Malachas. And first, we need to deal and try to come to a conclusion on Etzem HaMaisa, the thing into itself. Would it be defined as Malaches Mosheves? And the answer is yes, then it's a Malacha. And if it doesn't fit into Lamed Ches, Maka Bepatish. Second tremendous Chiddush is Enu Agdor and Maka Bepatish. So usually in yeshivas, everybody knows Maka Bepatish is Gemar Malacha. The importance of Gemar Malacha, that's Maka Bepatish. And that's correct. Clearly stated in Rashi Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph and in Tosfos Kuf Beis Amud Beis. But the Rambam Lanias Daiti has a totally different approach on Maka Bepatish. According to the Rambam, it is not Gemar Malacha. According to the Rambam, it is a Malacha of significance. Perek Yud Halacha Yud Zayin. Rambam Hilchos Shabbos. Perek Yud Halacha Yud Zayin. So there's a Gemara twice in Shas. Shabbos, Makis, Amapis Mursa, Chayev. If you would have an abscess and a doctor punches a hole to rinse out the pus, it's an infection. Chayev. What is he Chayev on? Which Malacha? Maka Bepatish. Why would it be defined as Maka Bepatish? Tosfos, Masechet Shabbos Gimel Amud Aleph, Kol Pesach she'osui lahachnis v'lahoitzi. So when the doctor punctures that abscess, he makes a Pesach, and the intention is air should go in, and the pus should come out, or the other fluids. But when the Rambam brings the halacha, the Rambam writes, Zuhi Malaches HaRoifim. Could we have the Rambam on the screen? It's Perek Yud, Halacha Yud Zayin of Hilchos Shabbos. Hamapis Shchin b'Shabbos kedei laharchav pi hamaka kederech sharoifim oisim shem eschavenen berefua laharchav pi hamaka. Harei ze chayim mishum maka bepatish shezui maleches haroifo. Zui maleches haroifo. So the Rambam doesn't say because it's a Pesach osui lahachnes v'lahoitzi. It is enough. Zui maleches haroif. Any medical procedure is a maisa of importance, of significance. A doctor cannot touch a patient and perform any surgical procedure only after 8 or 10 or 12 years of study. Zui meleches haroif, and that is enough to define it as Maka Bepatish. We find the Rambam again, Perusha Mishnah Masechet Ediyos, Perek Beis, Halacha Hey. Zui meleches haroif. Rambam L'shitose Perek Yud Tet Zayin. Let's go back one halacha. We just learned Perek Yud Halacha Yud Zayin. Let's see Tet Zayin. Maka Bepatish. Hakoa Achas Chayev. Koloi Sedo V'Shugma Halacha Reize told us Maka Bepatish v'Chayev. Amazing. Gemar Malacha is a tolda of Maka Bepatish. It is not the essence of Maka Bepatish. The essence of Maka Bepatish is a Maka Bepatish Hakoa Achas Chayev. Did you ever think, why do Chazal use the expression Maka Bepatish? According to Rashi and Tosfos Gemara Kli. Why patish? Why a hammer? My understanding of the Rambam is the most fundamental tool people had 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, were hammers. Big hammers, small hammers, use a sledgehammer to dislodge rocks from a mountain, and you use tiny little hammers, a watchmaker. But the most fundamental tool many years ago in days of yore was the hammer. So Chazal bring Maka Bepatish as a moshel, using tools to achieve a result. That is a malacha. So a Maka Bepatish Hakoach As Chayev. Kol Oisei Dov Shugma Malacha Reize told us Maka Bepatish. There is significance in a Gemara Malacha. So every Gemara Malacha is a Torah Dav Maka Bepatish. But what is Maka Bepatish? Maka Bepatish Kishmo Keinu. Using tools to achieve a goal that is significant, that is important, that is Maka Bepatish. Rambam, Perek Zayin Halacha Beis. We can go back to Perek Zayin Halacha Beis. Will be useful. The Rambam writes, Maka Bepatish Chayev, Afilu B'Gemar Malacha. Kol Eila HaMalachis. Doesn't seem to be in Halacha Beis. Let's see Halacha Chof. Maybe when I made my notes, I wasn't medactic. No, there is no Chof. So we will find, no, I just remember what my stake is. It's in Peresh HaMishnah Masechet Shabbos, Perek Klal Godel. Mishnah Beis, Halacha Beis, Peresh HaMishnah, Perek Zayin, out of Hilchos Shabbos, out of Masechet Shabbos. The Rambam writes, Hamaka Bepatish Chayev, Afilu B'Gemar Malacha. Not only B'Gemar Malacha, Afilu B'Gemar Malacha. So what I understand from the Rambam is, Maka Bepatish is not defined as Gemar Malacha. That is the shit of Rashi and Tosfos. According to the Rambam, Maka Bepatish Chayev Afilu B'Gemar Malacha. It's a revusa. Because more or less you achieved your goal. What you're lacking is just the finishing touches. Afal Piken, Maka Bepatish Chayev. So according to Rambam, Maka Bepatish, any significance, usually a significant malacha you achieve with tools. And that is Maka Bepatish. Coming back to the Yerushalmi. So I try to imagine that fateful Sunday, when the message was sent out, Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, both Gedolei Hador, will be answering Shilas and Hilchos Shabbos. People came with very different things. Then a person comes with his cell phone. So the one I'm holding is not a smartphone. It's a stupid phone, primitive one. Not many people have a cell phone like this today, only B'nai Torah. So a person comes with a cell phone and he asks Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, could I use this? And they say, what is this? What do you do with it? You scratch your head, presses a few buttons, and there's a voice coming out of this. Who is that? Is there a tiny little person in this machine? No, I'm talking with my wife. She's 1,000 miles away. Presses another button, and you see a face on the screen. And then he goes through all the functions. And Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish are amazed, and they say, this is Maka Bepatish. This is unbelievable. This is so creative and so significant. This is Maka Bepatish. So the discovery of electricity way, way before the smartphones was so revolutionary. Probably since the wheel, it was maybe the most significant technological breakthrough. Changed the world 1,000 times over. So in my opinion, closing an electrical circuit is Maka Bepatish, based on the Yerushalmi. I am aware that there's room to argue. Who says the Halacha Yerushalmi? Well, I think the Rambam is based on the Yerushalmi. I know a person could be machalek, but there's room to argue that it definitely is not a boina. I think what I say is as reasonable as the Chazon Ish. There's room to argue maybe it's not moilid. B'chlal, some achreinim say moilid ein lecho ela ma she'amru Chazal. So many things we do, and they're not moilid. Is there moilid when It's not something of the senses. Water is taste. Reach is smell. There's always room to argue. About 130 years since Poskim are dealing with electricity. And the collective Das Torah is, we're dealing with an Isser. So the first Poskim maintained that sin is the Rabbonim, the later Poskim is the Dioraisa. I wasn't there 140 years ago. I am following the Messiahs of Gedolei Yisrael. Using electricity is also, the question is, why? And I think my Mahalach based on the Yerushalmi is a very reasonable explanation why. So some Gedolim dealt with electricity and reached various conclusions because they weren't aware and knowledgeable what is electricity. So the Achiezer in his tshuva that I quoted, Chelek Gimel Simesalach, writes, Mashakos of God leichot bebeis vaad lechachomim, that in Yom Tov you could use electricity. The Achiezer harshly disagrees. And he says, no, it's a chashash ben Shabbos ben Yom Tov. Mishum kvoidoi, he didn't quote, who is that Gadol? But today there are no secrets. That Gadol was the Or HaShulchan. Rabbi Chiel Mechel Epstein, the Nevada HaRav, was one of the outstanding Gedolim of the time. And in a Kovetz Teironi, Beis Vad L'Chachamim, he wrote that he thinks Yom Tov, you could put on the lights or use electricity, not Shabbos, but Yom Tov. And the sources I quoted in Minchas Osher, I brought about 4 or 5 Sephardi Gedolim that write the same. But the Aruch HaShulchan clearly writes in his tshuva, which was reprinted a few years ago, a new sefer was printed, totally new, Shalos Tshuvas Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan didn't print tshuvas. This is a compilation of many tshuvas that were brought together. Siman Zayin is from the Beis Vad L'Chachamim. And the Aruch HaShulchan clearly writes in that tshuva, I am totally ignorant, I don't know what electricity is. And therefore, maybe I'm making a mistake. And he was making a mistake. But he was honest enough to write, I don't really know what I'm dealing with. But according to what I understand, this is my opinion. So the Aruch HaShulchan and some other Sephardi Gedolim write, Yom Tov, you could transfer fire from one ner to the other. You cannot make a new fire. But you could light Mener lener from an existing fire. So the Aruch HaShulchan writes, the fire is in the wires. We just bring it out to the open. But there is fire in the wires. And therefore it's not like Moiled Eish. There is no fire in the wires. No. How would he know? And he writes himself, I don't know. There is electrons in the wires. Every atom has electrons. Has a neutron, that's the nucleus of the atom, electrons, protons, and other microscopic particles. The flow of electrons causes friction. Friction causes heat. Heat causes light. The flow of electrons releases energy. But there is no fire in the wires. And if you're dealing with Mavir, it's a new fire. And when you're dealing with power, not with light, it's not fire. The malacha is a different malacha. Boina, moilid, my opinion, makabe padish. So there's no difference at all between Shabbos and Yom Tov. And you cannot close an electrical circuit, neither Shabbos nor Yom Tov. So this is an analysis of the development of the halachic discussion regarding electricity. Starting off with the Beis Yitzchak and the Masham, the greatest poskim of their era. Achiezer Chazon Ish, Many others from B'nai Doram Shalachi Yezav Chazanish write about electricity. I quoted Reb Shlomo Zalman. So the problem in recent years was based on the Chazanish. One could argue you could use electronics. To me, it is clear. Chas v'sholem. Ein mokum lahakol. It's going to change the nature of Shabbos. So as I explained before, it is upon us to define what is the Isser. And I think my Mahalach is Misyashev ala Leiv or Misyashev ala Das. And therefore I am a big machmir. Whenever we use technology, electronics, electricity to achieve our goal in any way. And in a letter that I wrote to HaRav that's on our screen, I didn't mention his name is Shum Kavoidoi because this letter has some harsh language, shelo kedarki. I always write and speak in a very respectable fashion, but I did feel that I need to be moicha because shelo tutar haritzuah. Because more and more present day Rabbonim were starting to be magical about using electricity. So as I said, in Shalosh Tuvas Minchasosha, there are about 5 or 6 tshuvas in all 3 volumes. The latest tshuva, I think it's on Chela Gimel, is about the kosher switch. A few years ago, somebody came out with a kosher switch, and that kosher switch is far from being kosher. And I voiced my opinion. A few years ago, I was invited to speak at a kenes. And I came a few minutes early, and the Rav that spoke before me said, as if the Chazanish asked using Chashmal on Shabbos, and Reb Shlomo Zalman was Matio. And the person said, I heard from Reb Shlomo Zalman, and I saw the need to be Moiche Barabi. And I said, Reb Shlomo Zalman was never Mekel b'Chashmal. It's a halachic discussion, Kedarka Shel Torah. Reb Shlomo Zalman is mefalpo with the Chazanish. He is mefakbek, whether it's reasonable to say it's boina. Like Ola al datoi klal uklal to be makel and using electricity and Shabbos. And whoever learns the tshuvas in Minchas Shloim, it is so obvious. Reb Shlomo Zalman had 100,000 talmidim. Everybody could say, I'm a talmid of Reb Shlomo Zalman, and anybody could say in his name whatever he wants. So I really think that it is my responsibility lahamed dvorim al mechoinam and yesh lahachmia, and we should assume that any use of electronics in any form, shape, any way is a chashash malocha diuraisa mishum makeh bepatish. And makeh bepatish, there is no difference about the exact science and technology. It is a malacha that has extreme significance. And the etzem closing of an electrical circuit is a chashash diurais. So on the screen, we have part of my tshuva, the Beis Vad L'Chachomim, the Aruch HaShulchan. And as I write, Ba'atzma yisnatzel b'tshuvosoi she'enu yodea b'ma'us inyan ha'elektri. So let me just finish the shiur with a very amusing note. One of the Gedolim that wrote about Chashmal, and once again, Mishum Koide, I don't want to quote the name, writes that there is Chashmal, which is told us Mayim, and there is Chashmal, which is told us Eish. Because that Gadol understood there are 2 ways to produce electricity. We burn fuel to achieve electricity, and sometimes we take care of the awesome power of running water. Most power plants today are built on dams, waterfalls, mighty rivers. But that's just total ignorance. Chashmal, electricity is produced when you use a magnetic field and you rotate wire or metal in a magnetic field. So we need a source of power to activate those turbines. And that energy is achieved either by burning fuel, any fossil fuel, or by taking advantage of the natural energy and power of running water. But there are not two types of electricity. There is only one type of electricity, and there's only one way to achieve that electricity. There is no toldas eish and toldas mayim. That is total ignorance. It's just two different natural sources of energy to turn those turbines and activate them. And therefore, as I made myself clear, closing an electrical circuit is a chashash malocha diuraisa, bein b'Shabbos, bein b'Yom Tov. And I follow in the footsteps of the Chazon Ish and Achiyeza. It is not moiled, which is the Rabbanan b'Madra diuraisa. And therefore, in my opinion, batteries are the same as any other source. Because at the end of the day, the result is the same. So there's no difference whether you're doing batteries or other forms of electricity. It is all about achieving the result. So this is my fundamental approach and opinion to electricity. I explained the Chazon Ish, the Beis Yitzchak, next week, B'siyata D'Shmaya, we're dealing with the practical implications and applications of what we discussed today. L'chumra v'l'kola. Pleasure and a zchus to be with you. Have a beautiful day.